I don't think I noticed the moment it started happening, if there even was a moment. When I try to think back now, I keep searching for some clear point where things shifted. Some conversation, some night, something that could explain how we got from where we started to where we ended. But the truth is, I can't find one. What I find instead are small memories. Little scenes that didn't seem important at the time. And somehow those are the ones that make the most sense now. Because nothing dramatic happened between us. Nothing exploded. We just slowly became comfortable strangers. And for a long time, I didn't even realize that's what we had become. When we first met, the thing I noticed most was how easy it felt to talk to her. Not exciting in the kind of way people describe when they talk about love at first sight. It was quieter than that. More like the feeling you get when a conversation moves naturally without either person trying too hard. We met at a friend's birthday dinner. The restaurant was loud in the way restaurants always are when too many people are sitting close together. I remember leaning forward a little just to hear what she was saying. She had a calm voice. Not soft exactly, just steady. And when she asked questions, she waited for the answer. That's something I notice about people now, actually. Whether they wait, whether they interrupt. She waited. At some point during the dinner, the rest of the table started talking about something I wasn't really interested in. Work gossip or something like that. But she turned slightly toward me and asked where I grew up. It was a simple question. The kind of question people ask without expecting a long answer. But when I answered, she asked another question. Then another. Not rapid fire. Just curious. And I remember thinking, halfway through that conversation, that I hadn't felt that kind of curiosity from someone in a long time. It wasn't intense. It wasn't overwhelming. It just felt genuine. And sometimes that's enough. The beginning of the relationship didn't feel dramatic. There was no moment where we suddenly declared that we were together. It happened gradually. We started meeting for coffee, then dinners, then long walks after dinner because neither of us felt ready to go home yet. I remember one night when we walked almost 3 miles without realizing how far we'd gone. The city was quiet. Most of the stores were already closed. Streetlights reflecting off the pavement. And the conversation just kept moving. From one story to another. From one thought to the next. Those walks felt endless in the best way. At some point we started spending weekends together. Not every weekend at first, but often enough that it started feeling natural. Saturday mornings at the same coffee shop. Sunday evenings cooking something simple at her apartment. Watching movies neither of us paid full attention to. It was comfortable. The kind of comfortable that makes you feel like you don't have to perform anymore. You don't have to be interesting every second. You can just exist in the same space. And for a while, that felt like exactly what both of us wanted. I remember the first time she fell asleep on the couch while we were watching something. Her head leaned against my shoulder. The movie was still playing, but neither of us was really watching anymore. Her breathing slowed, and I sat there for a while without moving because I didn't want to wake her up. It felt like one of those quiet moments people don't talk about much when they describe relationships. Not exciting. Not romantic in the dramatic sense. Just peaceful. If someone had asked me then where the relationship was going, I probably would have said something simple. Nowhere in particular. But I would have meant that in a good way. It felt steady. Predictable. Safe. And maybe that's why the changes were so hard to notice when they started happening. Because nothing in the structure of the relationship changed. The same routines continued. The same places. The same evenings on the couch. But something inside those routines slowly shifted. The first sign might have been the conversations. Not that they stopped. We still talked. Just differently. Earlier in the relationship, conversations wandered. We would start talking about work and somehow end up discussing childhood memories or strange things we remembered from high school. The conversation had movement, curiosity. But later, the conversations started staying closer to the surface. Schedules, plans, small updates. Nothing wrong with those conversations. They just didn't go anywhere new. And at first I told myself that was normal. Because when you know someone well, you already know most of their stories. There are fewer surprises. That's just how long relationships work. At least that's what I thought. But sometimes I would notice something else. Moments where she would laugh at something on her phone and not show it to me. Or moments where I would start telling a story and she would nod along, but the reaction felt lighter, not absent, just less engaged than before. I didn't say anything about it. Not because I was ignoring it. Because it didn't feel big enough to mention. It was just a feeling. A small shift. And feelings are hard to explain when you're not even sure what they mean yet. One night stands out in my memory more than the others. We were sitting on the couch again. The same couch where so many evenings had passed. She was scrolling through something on her phone. I was watching the television, though I couldn't tell you now what was playing. At one point she laughed quietly, not loud enough to interrupt the room. Just a short breath of amusement. I waited for her to show me whatever she was looking at. Earlier in the relationship, that would have happened automatically. But she didn't. She kept scrolling. And after a moment, I looked back at the television. Not upset, just aware. That's when the thought started forming. Not fully yet. Just the beginning of it. Something between us felt different. But the strange part was that nothing had actually changed. We still saw each other every day. Still had dinner together. Still went to the same coffee shop on weekends. From the outside, the relationship looked exactly the same. And maybe that's why it took me so long to understand what was happening. Distance doesn't always arrive in obvious ways. Sometimes it just grows quietly in the spaces where curiosity used to be. In the moments when two people stop asking each other new questions. Stop wondering what the other person is thinking. Stop reaching for the small details of each other's lives. And at first it feels like comfort, like stability. But eventually it starts to feel like something else. There was a night when I almost said something about it. We were lying in bed. The lights were off. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside. I remember staring at the ceiling and thinking about a question. It seemed simple in my mind. Do you still feel close to me? But the moment felt fragile. Like saying that out loud might change something that couldn't be changed back. So I didn't ask. And after a while she fell asleep beside me. We stayed together for months after that. Still sharing the same routines. Still moving through the same days. But the connection between us felt thinner. Not gone. Just fading. Like a conversation that had slowly drifted into background noise. And because the relationship itself was still intact, it was easy to pretend that nothing was really wrong. The realization came on a Sunday afternoon. We were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee. Sunlight coming through the window. The kind of ordinary moment that had happened 100 times before. She was the one who spoke first. I feel like we've become a little distant. Her voice wasn't accusing, just thoughtful. And the strange thing is that hearing her say it felt like relief. Because it meant I hadn't imagined it. The distance had been there. We just hadn't named it yet. We talked for a long time that afternoon. Not arguing. Just explaining. Trying to understand how something that once felt so natural had slowly become something quieter. At one point she said something that stayed with me. I think we got comfortable, she said. Then she paused. Maybe too comfortable. And I understood what she meant. Comfort had slowly replaced curiosity. Routine had replaced attention. We were still together, but we weren't discovering each other anymore. The breakup itself wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices. No sudden decisions. Just two people acknowledging something that had already been happening quietly for a long time. We hugged near the door. A long hug. The kind that says more than words do. Then I walked down the stairs and out into the street. Sometimes people expect breakups to feel explosive. But ours felt more like something that had slowly finished. Like the end of a conversation that had been fading for a while. And now, when I think about that relationship, the thing I remember most clearly isn't the ending. It's the middle. Those months where we were still sitting next to each other every night. Still sharing the same couch. Still sharing the same life. But something between us had already started changing. We became comfortable strangers. Two people who knew each other well. Two people who cared about each other. But who had slowly stopped reaching into the deeper parts of each other's lives. And for a long time, neither of us noticed. Or maybe we noticed earlier than we admitted. I'm still not completely sure. Sometimes late at night, I think about those quiet evenings on the couch. The ones where everything looked exactly the same as it always had. The same apartment. The same routine. The same two people sitting next to each other. And yet somehow the connection between us had already begun drifting somewhere else. Not dramatically. Not loudly, just slowly enough that it took both of us months to realize what was happening. And by the time we finally said it out loud, we were already a little farther apart than either of us had expected, even though we had been sitting in the same room the whole time. Sometimes I still think about those months after the distance had already started. Not the very end. The part before that. The part where everything looked normal enough that you could almost convince yourself nothing had really changed. Because that's the strange thing about quiet distance. It doesn't arrive like a storm. It arrives like silence. And silence is easy to live with for a while. There were evenings when the old version of us seemed to return for a moment. Small moments. We would laugh about something. Or one of us would tell a story that turned into a longer conversation. And during those moments, it almost felt like the beginning again. That same easy rhythm, the same curiosity. But the feeling never lasted very long. Eventually, the conversation would slow down again, and the quiet would return. Not awkward, just separate, like two people sitting next to each other while their thoughts drift somewhere else. I remember one Saturday morning in particular. We were at the same coffee shop we had been going to since the first month we started seeing each other. It had become part of our routine. The barista knew our orders before we said them. We usually sat near the window. That morning the place was busy. People talking, cups clinking against the counter, the low hum of music in the background. She was scrolling through something on her phone while we waited for our drinks. I watched people walking past outside. For a moment I realized something strange. Earlier in the relationship, waiting in line together would have turned into a conversation. Something small, a story about the week, an observation about someone in the cafe. But that morning we just stood there quietly. Not uncomfortable, just quiet. And for a second, I wondered whether she noticed the difference too. Sometimes I try to bring back the old rhythm. I would start telling her a story, something that happened at work, something funny a friend said, and she would listen. She always listened. But the reaction felt lighter, more polite than curious. Like the story was landing somewhere near her, but not really pulling her in. It's hard to explain that feeling. But once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. One evening, we went for a walk through the park near her apartment. It was late autumn. The air was cool enough that people were wearing jackets again, leaves scattered across the path. That park had been part of the relationship from the beginning. Some of our longest conversations had happened there. But that night, we walked almost the entire loop without saying much. At one point, she pointed at a dog running across the grass. We both laughed. Then we kept walking. And I remember thinking something quietly to myself. A year ago, this walk would have been filled with conversation. Now it felt more like two people sharing scenery. I didn't say anything about that thought. Not because I was avoiding it. Because it still didn't feel like enough to justify a serious conversation. Nothing bad had happened. No one had hurt the other. The relationship still existed. And sometimes that makes distance harder to confront, when there's no obvious reason for it. There was a night when the thought finally became clearer. We were sitting on the couch again, the same couch where so many of our evenings passed. The television was on. She was leaning against the armrest with her phone in her hand. I was sitting on the other side. At some point, she looked up from the screen. "Do you ever feel like we've gotten quieter?" she asked. Her tone wasn't worried, just curious. And hearing her say that felt strangely relieving. Because I had been thinking the same thing for a while. "Yeah," I said after a moment. "I think we have." Neither of us said anything else right away. The room stayed quiet. But it felt like a different kind of quiet now. Because the distance between us had finally been acknowledged. We talked about it for a while that night. Carefully, trying to understand what had changed. Not blaming each other. Just describing the feeling. At one point she said something that stayed with me. "I think we stopped being curious about each other," she said. She didn't say it with sadness, just observation. And when she said it, I realized how accurate it was. Curiosity had been one of the things that made the beginning of the relationship feel so alive. The questions, the long conversations, the feeling that there was always something new to discover about the other person. But somewhere along the way, that curiosity had slowly faded. We still cared about each other. That part was clear. But caring and curiosity aren't the same thing. And without curiosity, the relationship had slowly become something quieter, more familiar, more routine, but also more distant. After that conversation, something subtle shifted. Not dramatically, but we both seemed a little more aware of the space between us. Sometimes we tried to close it. More intentional conversations, more questions. But those moments felt slightly forced. Not fake, just conscious in a way they hadn't been before. And I think we both understood something. Closeness works best when it happens naturally. Once you start trying to recreate it deliberately, it often means something has already changed. The final weeks of the relationship felt strangely peaceful. Not because everything was fixed, because we had stopped pretending. We both knew the connection had shifted, and acknowledging that made things calmer somehow. More honest. The conversation that ended everything happened on a quiet afternoon. We were sitting at the kitchen table again, coffee cups in front of us. Sunlight coming through the window, the same setting where hundreds of ordinary conversations had happened before. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said something simple. "I think we've been slowly becoming strangers." The sentence stayed in the air between us. Not heavy, just honest. And after a moment, I nodded, because it felt true. We talked for a while after that. Not arguing, just explaining what the past months had felt like. How the distance had arrived quietly. How neither of us had noticed it right away. How we both kept assuming it was temporary. Until eventually it wasn't. The goodbye itself was simple. We stood near the door, hugged for a long moment. Neither of us said anything dramatic. Just a quiet understanding. Then I walked down the stairs, out into the street. Sometimes people expect breakups to feel like explosions, but ours felt more like the slow end of a conversation. The moment when both people realize there's nothing left to add. Not because the relationship wasn't real, because the connection inside it had quietly changed. Now when I think about that time, what stands out the most are those evenings on the couch. The quiet ones. The ones where everything looked exactly the same as it always had. The same apartment. The same routine. The same two people sitting next to each other. But something between us had already started drifting somewhere else. We became comfortable strangers. Two people who knew each other well. Two people who shared routines and memories, but who had slowly stopped reaching for the deeper parts of each other's lives. And the strange part is how long it took both of us to realize it. Because from the outside, nothing had changed at all. It was the same couch, the same evenings, the same life. Except the connection between us had quietly faded somewhere along the way. And by the time we finally said it out loud, we were already a little farther apart than either of us expected. Even though we had been sitting right next to each other the whole time. Sometimes I wonder if the distance actually started earlier than either of us realized. Not in the last months. Not even in the middle of the relationship. But somewhere before that. Somewhere hidden inside the routine. Because when I replay those years in my mind, the memories don't feel divided into clear chapters. They feel more like a slow transition from one atmosphere to another. At first, everything felt open. Later, everything felt settled. And eventually, it felt quiet. I remember a winter evening during the second year we were together. Snow had started falling earlier that afternoon. Not heavy snow, just enough to soften the streets and make the city feel slower. We had ordered takeout because neither of us felt like cooking. The apartment was warm. The kind of warmth that makes you feel like you don't need to go anywhere else that night. We sat on the couch eating from the containers, watching something on television. At one point she leaned her head against my shoulder. Not dramatically, just naturally, like she had done many times before. And I remember thinking something simple. This is what stability feels like. Not excitement, not intensity, just calm. At the time I thought that calm meant the relationship had matured, that it had become something deeper. But now I'm not always sure that's what it was. Sometimes I think that calm was also the beginning of the distance. Comfort has a strange effect on relationships. It removes the pressure to impress each other, which is good. But sometimes it also removes the curiosity. You stop asking questions because you assume you already know the answers. You stop sharing certain thoughts because you think the other person has already heard them before. And slowly, without either person realizing it, the conversations become smaller, more practical, more routine. There was a phase where we talked mostly about logistics. What time we would meet after work, what we should cook, whether we needed groceries, plans for the weekend. None of those conversations were bad. They were just functional. And when a relationship becomes mostly functional, something subtle starts disappearing. Not affection, something else, something harder to name. I think about one moment in particular. It was late. We had both been quiet for a while. The television was on again, though neither of us was really paying attention. She was sitting cross-legged on the couch, her phone resting in her lap. I remember glancing at her and realizing something strange. We hadn't asked each other a real question all evening. Not a logistical one. Not a casual comment. A real question. The kind that opens a conversation. And when that thought landed, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not sadness. More like awareness. The distance wasn't caused by one event. It was caused by the absence of small things. Curiosity. Attention. The instinct to reach into the other person's inner world. Those things had slowly faded. And neither of us noticed the exact moment when it happened. For a long time after the breakup, I tried to understand whether someone was responsible for that shift, whether I had pulled away first, or whether she had. But the more I thought about it, the less that question made sense. Because the distance didn't feel like something one person created. It felt like something that formed quietly between us, like a space that slowly widened. Sometimes I replay the earlier memories. The walks, The balcony conversations. The nights when we talked until 2 in the morning without noticing the time. Those moments felt alive. Not because they were dramatic. Because we were curious about each other. Every story led to another story. Every thought opened another question. We were discovering each other constantly. And that discovery created movement, energy, connection. Later, we stopped discovering. We already knew the routines, the habits, the stories. And instead of continuing to explore each other's thoughts, we began living beside each other. Not together in the same emotional space, just beside. I think that's why the couch stands out so clearly in my memory. Because that's where the transition happened. At first, the couch was where we talked for hours. Later, it became where we rested. Eventually, it became where we sat quietly while our attention drifted elsewhere. The same piece of furniture. 3 completely different relationships. There was a night, months after we had already started drifting, when something almost changed. She turned off the television. The room went quiet. Then she looked at me and asked, "Do you think people change in relationships?" It was an unexpected question, the kind that used to start long conversations between us. So I answered honestly, "I think people don't always notice when they change." She nodded slowly. Then she looked down at her hands. For a moment, I thought the conversation might continue, that maybe we would talk about what had been happening between us. But instead, she said something simple. "That makes sense." And then she turned the television back on. That moment stayed with me. Not because it was dramatic, because it felt like a doorway that briefly opened, and then quietly closed again. Neither of us stepped through it. Maybe we were afraid of what we might find on the other side. Or maybe we both sensed something deeper, that the distance wasn't something that could be solved with one conversation. After we broke up, people asked me the same question again and again. What happened? And every time I tried to answer, the explanation sounded incomplete. Because there wasn't a clear event. No betrayal. No fight. No moment where everything suddenly fell apart. There was just a slow change in atmosphere. 2 people who gradually stopped reaching toward each other. 2 lives that continued side by side until the space between them became impossible to ignore. Now, when I sit alone in the evenings, I sometimes notice how quiet the apartment is. Not empty, just quiet. And occasionally, I find myself remembering those nights on the couch. The comfortable ones. The quiet ones. The ones where we sat right next to each other, but were already drifting apart without realizing it. It took me a long time to understand something about that experience. Closeness isn't measured by time spent together, or by routines, or by how often 2 people sit in the same room. Closeness lives in curiosity, in attention, in the small instinct to ask another question even after years. And when that instinct fades, the relationship can continue for a while. The routines stay, the habits stay, but the connection slowly dissolves. We didn't become enemies. We didn't even become strangers immediately. We became something quieter than that. Comfortable strangers. 2 people who shared history, shared routines, shared a version of life for a while, but who slowly stopped discovering each other along the way. And sometimes late at night, when everything around me is still, I think about that version of us again. Not the beginning, not the ending, just the middle. The long, quiet middle where we were still sitting next to each other every night. Still sharing the same couch. Still sharing the same life. But something between us had already begun slipping somewhere else. And neither of us noticed how far it had gone until the silence between us finally had a name. By then, we were already sitting a little farther apart than we realized.